A police dog was shot by a criminal, but what happened next proved he was a true hero. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sound of gunfire split through the night. Officer Mark Reynolds barely had time to react before his K9 partner, Shadow, lunged forward. The German Shepherd moved in a blur, his instincts razor-sharp as he charged toward the armed suspect. Everything happened too fast. One moment they had cornered the criminal, and the next, the man had drawn a weapon and fired. The gunshot echoed off the alley walls. Mark's heart clenched as he saw Shadow stumble mid-stride. The dog let out a sharp, pained yelp before collapsing onto the pavement, his body twisting from the impact. Blood pooled beneath his tan fur, staining the concrete in a way that made Mark's stomach churn. Shadow! Mark's voice cracked as he ran to his fallen partner, his pulse pounding in his ears. His grip on his firearm tightened. His mind split between stopping the shooter and saving his partner. The suspect, a wiry man in a black hoodie, was already sprinting away, his breath ragged as he disappeared around the corner. Mark wanted to chase after him, to finish the job, but Shadow was lying there, his body twitching, struggling to breathe. Mark dropped to his knees, pressing his hands against the wound just behind the dog's shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers, hot and sticky. Shadow whimpered but didn't move, his ears still perked, his eyes trying to focus on Mark despite the pain. "Stay with me, buddy," Mark whispered, his throat tightening. "You're gonna be okay." He reached for his radio, pressing the button with shaking fingers. "Officer down. K9 hit. We need immediate medical assistance at the corner of 5th and Lexington. Suspect fleeing northbound on foot." The response was immediate. Backup was on the way, but it wasn't fast enough. Shadow's breathing was getting shallow, and Mark could feel the tremors in his partner's body. He had trained with Shadow for years. The dog was more than a partner, he was family. The thought of losing him now was unbearable. Footsteps pounded against the pavement. Sergeant Alvarez arrived first, his gun drawn as he scanned the scene. "Where's the shooter?" Mark barely looked up. "Gone. Northbound. We need to get Shadow out of here." Alvarez knelt beside them, his face grim as he took in the bleeding dog. "We've got medics en route." "Not fast enough," Mark snapped. He could see it. Shadow was fading. The light in his eyes was dimming, and his body was getting heavier in Mark's arms. Every second counted. An unmarked black SUV screeched to a halt nearby, and 2 officers jumped out. One of them carried a medical kit. "We've got him," the officer said, kneeling beside Shadow. He pulled out gauze, pressing it against the wound as another officer checked the dog's pulse. "We need to move him now." Mark wasn't willing to wait. He scooped Shadow into his arms, ignoring the weight and the warmth of the blood soaking through his uniform. The officers flanked him as he carried Shadow to the SUV. "Get him to the emergency vet," Mark ordered. "I'll meet you there." Alvarez put a firm hand on Mark's shoulder. "We'll get the guy. Go with him." Mark hesitated, torn between duty and the life slipping away in his arms. But one look at Shadow made the choice clear. He climbed into the back seat, cradling the wounded dog as the SUV sped away. The ride was a blur. Mark barely registered the passing streets, his mind consumed with silent prayers and whispered reassurances. "You're gonna be fine, boy. Just hang on." Shadow's breaths were shallow, but his tail gave the faintest twitch, as if he were trying to comfort Mark instead of the other way around. By the time they arrived at the emergency vet clinic, a team was already waiting. Mark barely had time to step out before the veterinary staff pulled Shadow onto a gurney and rushed him inside. The doors swung shut, leaving Mark standing there, his hands covered in his partner's blood, his chest heaving. Time stretched endlessly as he paced the waiting room, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and guilt. If he had reacted a second sooner, if he had been faster, smarter, maybe Shadow wouldn't have been shot. A hand on his shoulder made him jump. Alvarez had arrived, his face unreadable. "We got him," he said simply. Mark swallowed hard. "The shooter?" Alvarez nodded. "Pinned him 2 blocks over." He didn't get far. Mark clenched his fists. I don't care about him. I care about Shadow. As if on cue, a vet in blue scrubs emerged from the operating room, her expression tense. Officer Reynolds? Mark's stomach twisted into knots. Is he? She held up a hand. He's stable for now, but it was close. The bullet missed his heart by inches. We stopped the bleeding, but he's not out of the woods yet. Mark exhaled a shaky breath. His knees felt weak. Can I see him? The vet nodded. He's sedated, but yes. Just for a moment, Mark followed her down the hallway, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. When he stepped into the recovery room, his heart clenched. Shadow lay on a padded table, IVs attached to his leg, his chest rising and falling steadily. Mark approached slowly, placing a hand on the dog's head. Hey, buddy, he murmured. You scared the hell out of me. Shadow didn't move, but his tail twitched ever so slightly. Mark swallowed against the lump in his throat. You're a hero, you know that? Alvarez leaned against the doorway. Damn right he is. The weight on Mark's chest lifted just a little. Shadow had fought for him. Now it was Mark's turn to fight for Shadow. The sterile scent of antiseptic and medical-grade disinfectant clung to the air in the veterinary clinic, but Mark barely noticed. He was seated beside Shadow's recovery bed, his fingers gently stroking the dog's fur, careful to avoid the bandages wrapped around his partner's shoulder. The steady rise and fall of Shadow's breathing was the only thing keeping Mark grounded. The rhythmic beeping of the monitoring equipment was a reminder that his best friend was still alive, but the weight of what had happened still sat heavy on his chest. Alvarez had left a few hours ago, telling Mark to get some rest, but that was impossible. The moment he closed his eyes, he heard the gunshot, saw Shadow lurch forward, felt the hot spray of blood against his hands. He clenched his jaw and exhaled through his nose, willing the memory to fade, but it refused. A nurse entered the room quietly, her footsteps careful, as if she didn't want to disturb him. You should try to get some sleep, she murmured. Mark shook his head. Not happening. She offered a small, understanding smile. He's stable now. He's lucky the bullet didn't hit anything vital. Mark exhaled sharply. He shouldn't have been shot at all. His fingers curled into the fabric of his jeans. He saved my life, and I couldn't stop it. The nurse hesitated before speaking again. You know, officers come in here all the time with their K-9 partners. Some of them don't make it. I've seen the way you look at him. It's not just a working relationship. He's family, isn't he? Mark swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah, he is. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder before stepping away. Then you'll fight for him, just like he fought for you. Mark watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. He turned his attention back to Shadow, his hand never leaving the dog's fur. You hear that, buddy? You're gonna be fine. I'm gonna make sure of it. Hours passed in a blur. Mark refused to leave, even when his back ached from sitting in the same position. Officers from his precinct came by in waves, bringing him coffee, asking for updates, offering support. Even the police chief showed up, placing a firm hand on Mark's shoulder before looking at Shadow with something that almost resembled reverence. This department owes him, the chief said. We're gonna make sure he gets the best care possible. Mark nodded but said nothing. He didn't need promises. He needed Shadow to wake up. Then, just as the clock ticked past 3 in the morning, a soft whimper broke through the silence. Mark's breath caught. Shadow's tail twitched. His paws moved slightly, his ears flicking at a sound only he could hear. Then, slowly, groggily, his eyes cracked open. Mark surged forward. Shadow? Hey, buddy, I'm here. The dog blinked, his gaze unfocused. Then, recognition flickered in his golden brown eyes. His tail gave a weak thump against the bed. Mark let out a shaky laugh, pressing a hand to his chest as relief crashed over him. You scared the hell out of me, he whispered. Shadow let out a soft, tired huff, as if to say, you're being dramatic. Mark chuckled. Yeah, just don't ever do that again. Okay? Shadow blinked slowly, his tail thumping once more. He was still weak, but he was here, and that was enough. The next few days were a whirlwind of recovery. Shadow remained at the clinic under close observation, but the moment he started trying to sit up, the vets knew he was on the mend. The department pulled every string they could to ensure he had the best care available. Donations poured in from officers, community members, even people Mark had never met. Then came the media storm. News outlets caught wind of the K9 hero who had taken a bullet for his handler. And soon, Shadow's story was everywhere. Reporters stationed themselves outside the clinic, hoping for an update. The police department was flooded with calls, emails, and letters of support. Some people even sent gifts, boxes of treats, new toys, blankets embroidered with Shadow's name. Mark didn't care about the attention. He only cared about one thing: Shadow getting better. On the 5th day, when Shadow managed to stand on his own, the entire clinic staff erupted into applause. Mark grinned, crouching beside his partner, scratching behind his ears. "Knew you'd bounce back," he murmured. Shadow gave him a look, one ear twitching as if to say, "Of course I did." By the end of the week, Shadow was well enough to go home. The department organized a special escort, a convoy of police cars leading the way, sirens blaring in celebration. The streets were lined with people holding signs, cheering as the car carrying Shadow pulled up to the precinct. Mark opened the door and helped his partner step out. Shadow's movements were still slow, but his tail wagged as he took in the sight before him. Officers lined the steps, clapping and whistling. Children waved homemade signs with "Welcome Home, Shadow," written in bright, messy letters. Mark knelt beside his dog, ruffling his fur. "Looks like you're a celebrity now," Shadow huffed. Mark smiled. "You earned it." As they walked up the steps together, Mark knew one thing for certain. Shadow wasn't just a K9 officer. He was a hero, and he always would be. The days after Shadow's return home were a whirlwind. Mark had expected things to settle down, for life to return to normal, but the truth was, things had changed forever. The police department had received an overwhelming number of requests for interviews, donations, and even honorary awards for Shadow. The public had embraced the story of a K9 officer willing to sacrifice himself to protect his handler, and Shadow had become more than just a police dog. He had become a symbol of loyalty and bravery. Mark had never been one for the spotlight. He preferred the quiet moments of his job, the camaraderie of his fellow officers, the routine of patrol shifts. But now, cameras followed him wherever he went. News stations wanted exclusive interviews, community groups wanted to feature Shadow at charity events, and even the mayor's office had reached out, requesting an appearance at an upcoming public safety event. Through it all, Mark tried to focus on what mattered most: Shadow's recovery. The bullet wound had healed well, but there was still stiffness in the dog's movements, and the vet had warned that he might never regain full agility. That part stung. Shadow had always been an unstoppable force on the field, a blur of motion and precision. The thought of him slowing down, of possibly being retired early, was something Mark wasn't ready to face. One evening, after another long day of checkups and public appearances, Mark sat on the porch with Shadow beside him. The German Shepherd rested his head against Mark's knee, his body warm and steady. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the sky, and for the first time in days, everything felt peaceful. "You okay, buddy?" Mark murmured, running his fingers through Shadow's fur. The dog let out a soft huff, his tail flicking slightly. Mark smiled. "Yeah, me neither. There was so much to process. So much that had happened in just a few short weeks." Mark had always known that his job was dangerous, that every shift could be his last. But the reality of how close he had come to losing Shadow still haunted him. He sighed, leaning back against the porch railing. "They're talking about retiring you," he admitted softly. "Chief says it might be time." Shadow's ears twitched at the words, but he didn't move. Mark swallowed. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if you're ready for that." Shadow let out a slow breath, pressing his weight more firmly against Mark's side. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. He was still here. He was still fighting. The following week, the department held a formal ceremony to honor Shadow's bravery. The precinct was packed. Officers, city officials, reporters, and members of the community had all gathered to witness the moment. Shadow, dressed in his formal K9 vest, sat beside Mark as the chief took the stage. "We are gathered here today," the chief began, "to recognize an officer who has shown extraordinary courage in the line of duty. An officer who, without hesitation, stepped between danger and his partner, saving a life and proving, once again, the unwavering loyalty of our K9 unit." Applause erupted from the crowd. Shadow didn't flinch. He simply sat there, calm and composed, his golden eyes surveying the people before him. Mark smiled. "You're stealing the show, pal." As the ceremony continued, Mark found himself reflecting on everything that had led them to this moment. He had always believed in Shadow, had always trusted him with his life, but now the world knew what he had always known. Shadow was more than just a police dog. He was a hero. When the chief finally presented Shadow with a special K9 Medal of Valor, Mark felt a lump form in his throat. The audience stood in unison, clapping, cheering, some even wiping away tears. Mark crouched beside his partner, adjusting the medal around his neck. "You deserve this," he whispered. Shadow licked his hand in response. That night, as they returned home, Mark knew things would never be the same. Shadow's future was uncertain. Whether he would return to duty or retire was still undecided. But one thing was clear. No matter what happened, they had been through hell together, and they had made it out the other side. And that was enough. Mark sat on his couch that evening, his hands resting on his knees as Shadow lay at his feet. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. The ceremony had been overwhelming. The applause, the speeches, the flashing cameras. It was meant to be a celebration of Shadow's heroism, a recognition of his sacrifice. But all Mark could think about was what came next. The department wanted to retire Shadow. It wasn't an easy decision, but Mark understood why. Shadow had taken a bullet, and though he had healed faster than expected, he wasn't the same. His agility was slightly off, his stamina lower. Mark had trained with him long enough to notice the smallest changes. The way his partner hesitated before jumping into the patrol car, the slight limp when he stood up too fast. The job required more than loyalty. It required peak physical ability, and Shadow had given everything he had. Mark rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling deeply. He knew the reality of K9 retirements. Some officers had to give up their partners, to send them off to new homes, where they would live out their final years in comfort but away from their handlers. Mark couldn't let that happen. "You belong here," he murmured, looking down at the German Shepherd. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of Mark's voice, his ears twitching slightly. He wasn't asleep, just resting, the kind of rest he had earned 10 times over. Mark reached down, running his fingers through the fur along Shadow's back. "I don't know how to do this job without you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Shadow let out a slow breath, resting his head back down on his paws. He didn't need to say anything. He never did. The next morning, Mark made his way to the precinct, where Chief Alvarez was waiting for him. The older man leaned against his desk, arms crossed, watching as Mark entered. "You've been avoiding this conversation," Alvarez said. Mark sighed. "Yeah." Alvarez nodded, pushing a file toward him. "I've already got 3 handlers lined up for a new recruit. It's time." Mark's jaw tightened. He's still got fight left in him. "No one's denying that," Alvarez said. "But we both know he's not at 100% anymore. We can't risk another situation where his body gives out when it matters most." Mark clenched his fists. He hated how much sense that made. Alvarez leaned forward. "I know you don't want to let him go, and you don't have to. You've got first priority to adopt him. If you want him to stay with you, he can. But he's done, Mark. You both know it." Mark exhaled slowly. He had spent years preparing Shadow for the field, training him, working alongside him, trusting him with his life. Letting go felt like losing a part of himself. But the truth was, Shadow had already given his all. Mark finally nodded. "I'll take him home." Alvarez gave him a firm pat on the back. "You're making the right choice. That evening, when Mark walked through his front door, Shadow was there to greet him, tail wagging slightly, eyes bright. The dog tilted his head, sensing something different. Mark knelt down, scratching behind his ears. "Looks like you're officially retired, buddy," Shadow huffed, licking Mark's hand. Mark smiled. "Guess that means we've got a whole new adventure ahead of us." And for the first time in weeks, he felt at peace with that. The adjustment to civilian life was harder than Mark expected. For years, his routine had been set. Morning runs with Shadow, training exercises, patrol shifts, late nights filled with paperwork and debriefs. His life had revolved around the rhythm of the job, and Shadow had always been there, ready for the next call, the next chase, the next challenge. Now, things were different. The first few mornings after Shadow's retirement felt unnatural. Mark woke up expecting to hear the familiar jingle of Shadow's collar, the soft padding of his paws against the hardwood floor. But there was no urgency to get dressed in his uniform. No need to double-check Shadow's harness and gear before heading out. Shadow, for his part, was adjusting better than Mark. The dog had adapted quickly to being home full-time, lounging on the couch instead of in a patrol car, enjoying midday walks instead of training drills. He still followed Mark around the house, still watched him with sharp, intelligent eyes, but there was a noticeable ease in his posture, as if he finally understood that he didn't have to be on high alert anymore. Mark, on the other hand, struggled. His first shift without Shadow felt wrong. He climbed into his squad car, adjusted his radio, and reached toward the passenger seat, only to find it empty. His new partner, Officer Jeremy Klein, sat in the seat instead, offering him an awkward nod. It wasn't the same. Mark forced himself to focus, gripping the steering wheel tightly as they pulled onto the streets. The calls came in as usual: traffic violations, disturbances, a few routine stops. But there was a weight in his chest, a hollow space beside him where Shadow used to be. During lunch, Klein glanced at him over a takeout box. "So, how's Shadow doing?" Mark exhaled, stirring his coffee. "He's fine. Better than me, honestly." Klein smirked. "Yeah, I can tell. You're looking at that empty seat like a widow staring at an old photograph." Mark shot him a look, but there was no real malice behind it. Klein shrugged. "I get it, man. Losing a partner," he hesitated. "I mean, I know he's not gone, but it probably feels that way." Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does." They fell into silence for a moment. Then Klein grinned. "So, has he turned into a lazy house dog yet?" Mark chuckled despite himself. "Not quite. He still patrols the backyard like it's an active crime scene. I think he's waiting for me to tell him to suit up again." Klein leaned back. "Maybe he's waiting for you to adjust." Mark swallowed hard, realizing there was some truth in that. That night, when he got home, Shadow was waiting at the door, tail wagging, eager as ever. Mark knelt down, ruffling the dog's fur. "Hey, buddy, how was your day?" Shadow huffed, nudging his head against Mark's chest. Mark sighed, sitting on the floor beside him. "It's weird without you," he admitted. "Guess I've got to figure this out." "Huh?" Shadow licked his cheek, his tail thumping against the floor. Mark chuckled softly. Yeah, I hear you. Maybe it was time to stop looking at this as a loss. Maybe it was just a new chapter. Shadow had done his part. Now it was Mark's turn to learn how to move forward. A month had passed since Shadow's retirement, and though life had settled into a new rhythm, Mark still felt the void every time he stepped into his patrol car. The routine wasn't the same without his partner riding shotgun, without the sharp eyes and alert posture of a dog, ready to protect and serve. Shadow had been more than just a working dog. He had been his anchor. But slowly, things were changing. Shadow had adapted to civilian life far better than Mark had. He spent his days lounging on the couch, enjoying leisurely walks, and watching the neighborhood with a quiet attentiveness. He wasn't chasing down suspects anymore, but there was still a sharpness in his eyes, a sense of duty that hadn't faded with retirement. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch, sipping his beer and watching the sunset, Shadow sat beside him, ears perked. The two of them had always shared these quiet moments, even after long shifts. "You miss it, don't you?" Mark murmured, glancing down at his old partner. Shadow didn't move, but his ears flicked, his tail giving the faintest twitch. Mark sighed. Me too. There were nights when Mark still reached for Shadow's harness out of habit. He had spent so many years training, working, trusting this dog with his life that it felt unnatural to leave him behind every morning. But this was the right choice. Shadow had earned this life, the comfort, the peace. Still, Mark knew he needed to fill the gap, to find something to channel his energy into. The answer came unexpectedly. A week later, Mark received a call from Chief Alvarez. "We've got a new recruit," he said. "Young, inexperienced, but promising. Thought you might want to take a look." Mark frowned. "A new officer?" Alvarez chuckled. "A new K9. Something in Mark's chest tightened. "You want me to train him?" "Only if you're up for it," Alvarez said. "Thought it might be good for both of you." Mark hesitated. Training a new K9 was a big responsibility. It wasn't just about commands and discipline, it was about trust, about building a partnership. Could he really do that again? Could he open himself up to working with another dog after Shadow? That evening, he sat beside Shadow, scratching behind his ears. "They want me to train a rookie," he said. Shadow's tail thumped once. Mark smirked. Yeah, I know. No one will ever replace you." Shadow huffed, resting his head on Mark's lap. Mark exhaled, running a hand down his old partner's back. Maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing, though. Teaching some new pup the ropes. Making sure the next K9 on the force knows how to do the job right. Shadow didn't respond, but the warmth of his presence was answer enough. Mark made his decision the next morning. When he arrived at the training facility, a young German shepherd sat patiently in front of the lead trainer. His ears perked, eyes bright with curiosity. He was younger than Shadow had been when they first started, eager but undisciplined, full of potential. Mark crouched down, meeting the dog's gaze. "Hey there, rookie." The pup tilted his head, sniffing curiously before sitting up straight. Mark chuckled. "You're gonna have big shoes to fill." The trainer handed Mark the leash. "Think you can handle him?" Mark glanced down at the young dog, then back at the trainer. "Yeah," he said, gripping the leash firmly. "I think we'll be just fine." That evening, when he got home, Shadow greeted him at the door as always, tail wagging lazily. Mark knelt down, running a hand over his old partner's head. "Guess I'm training someone new," he murmured. Shadow blinked slowly, as if he already knew. Mark smiled. "Don't worry, buddy. You'll always be my first." And with that, the final chapter of their time on the force had closed, but a new one had just begun. The transition into training a new K9 officer was far from easy. Mark had expected challenges, but he hadn't realized just how much starting over would test him emotionally. Shadow had been his first and only K9 partner for years, and the trust between them had been built through experience, hardship, and an unspoken understanding. Now, as he worked with Ace, the young German shepherd with boundless energy and a tendency to get distracted, Mark found himself frustrated more often than not. "Focus," he muttered under his breath, gripping the leash as Ace lunged after a squirrel during a routine training drill. "You're not a house pet, rookie. You've got a job to do." Ace let out a sharp bark but quickly corrected himself, his ears twitching as if he could sense Mark's disappointment. The lead trainer chuckled from the sidelines. "You're expecting too much too soon, Reynolds." Shadow didn't come out of the academy fully trained either. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew that. He really did. But patience had never been his strong suit. He had spent so long working with a seasoned veteran, a dog who could read his body language and anticipate his every move, that he had forgotten what it was like to start from scratch. Still, he wasn't about to give up. By the time they wrapped up the training session for the day, Ace had improved slightly. He still needed work, but the potential was there. It just had to be shaped just like Shadow had once been. When Mark arrived home, Shadow was waiting for him at the door, his tail wagging in greeting. Despite the limp that had started to become more noticeable in his old age, he still stood proudly, watching as Mark stepped inside. Mark knelt down, ruffling Shadow's fur. "You wouldn't believe the mess I'm dealing with," he murmured. This kid's got no discipline. Shadow huffed, resting his head against Mark's arm. Mark chuckled. Yeah, you had your moments too. He sighed, leaning back against the couch, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. I don't know, buddy. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I just don't have the patience anymore. Shadow lifted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto Mark's. Mark knew that look. It was the same one Shadow had given him during their early days of training, when Mark had doubted himself before. It was a look that said, "You figure things out. You always do." Mark exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're right. I just have to give it time." Shadow let out a small huff of agreement before curling up beside him. Mark sat in silence for a long time, his hand absently stroking Shadow's fur. Maybe this wasn't just about training Ace. Maybe this was about learning to trust the process again, about accepting that things wouldn't ever be the same as before. But that didn't mean they couldn't be good. Ace wasn't Shadow, but that didn't mean he couldn't be great in his own way. For the first time since Shadow's retirement, Mark let go of the comparison. Maybe, just maybe, he could do this after all. The following weeks were a test of patience, resilience, and trust. Training Ace had become a daily battle, a constant push and pull between discipline and instinct. The young German Shepherd had the raw potential to be a great K9 officer, but he was undisciplined, impulsive, and far too eager to please. Mark had never had to start over before. Not like this. With Shadow, everything had come naturally after the first few months. Their bond had been strong, unshakable. With Ace, things were different. One afternoon, during a controlled drill, Ace was supposed to track a planted suspect through a warehouse, following nothing but a scent trail. Mark released him, his heart pounding as the dog sprinted ahead. At first, it seemed like he had finally locked in. His posture was confident, his nose pressed to the ground, his movements precise. Then, just as he neared the location where the decoy was hiding, Ace froze. Mark's brows furrowed. "Go on, Ace. Find him." The dog hesitated, sniffing the air, then turned back toward Mark instead. Mark clenched his jaw. "No. Track." Ace whimpered slightly, ears flattening. He was unsure, second-guessing himself. Mark sighed, stepping forward. "You've got to trust yourself, rookie." The lead trainer walked up beside him, arms crossed. "He's looking for your approval instead of trusting his instincts." Mark exhaled through his nose. "I know." It was frustrating. Ace had all the tools, all the potential, but he lacked confidence. He was afraid of making a mistake. And then it hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Ace wasn't the only one struggling to trust. Mark had spent every session holding back, comparing him to Shadow, expecting him to fail. Shadow had been a partner, an equal. With Ace, Mark was still treating him like a replacement. That night, as he sat on the porch with Shadow beside him, the weight of the realization settled deep in his chest. "I've been doing this all wrong," he muttered. Shadow lifted his head slightly, eyes glinting in the dim porch light. Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've been trying to make him you." Shadow blinked. Mark chuckled dryly. "Yeah, I know. Stupid, right?" Shadow let out a slow breath, resting his head against Mark's leg. Mark exhaled. "Tomorrow I try again. No more comparing. No more treating him like he'll never live up to you." Shadow's tail gave a single, slow wag. The next morning, Mark approached training with a new mindset. This time, when he gave Ace the command to track, he let him take the lead. He didn't micromanage, didn't interfere. Ace hesitated at first, but then something shifted. The young dog's ears perked, his tail stiffened, and this time, he didn't turn back. Instead, he charged forward, nose locked onto the scent, body moving with purpose. When he reached the decoy, he let out a sharp bark, standing his ground. Mark's heart swelled. "There you go," he murmured. "That's my boy." Ace turned, and for the first time, Mark saw it, the confidence. And in that moment, Mark finally let go of the past. Shadow had been his first, his greatest, but Ace was his future, and he was ready. Mark's transition to training Ace had been rough, but now, standing in the training facility, and watching the young German Shepherd complete an agility course with sharp precision and confidence, he felt something shift. This was the first time since Shadow's retirement that he wasn't waiting for failure, wasn't expecting disappointment. Ace was fast, alert, and, more importantly, finally believed in himself. Mark watched as the dog leaped over a barrier, landed smoothly, then sprinted toward the final obstacle. A narrow balance beam elevated a few feet off the ground. A month ago, Ace would have hesitated, waiting for Mark's reassurance. But now, he barely slowed, charging forward and crossing it without a single misstep. When Ace reached the finish line, he spun back toward Mark, tongue lolling, tail wagging in excitement. Mark crouched down, grinning. "Not bad, rookie." Ace let out a happy bark and bounded toward him. The trainer, who had been monitoring from a distance, chuckled as she approached. "He's come a long way," she said. "But I think the real change was in you." Mark arched a brow. "Me?" She nodded. "You finally started treating him like his own dog instead of trying to make him into Shadow." Mark exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He had resisted hearing that truth for too long. But she was right. And now, as he watched Ace thrive, he realized that the ache in his chest, the one that had been there since Shadow's last day on duty, wasn't as heavy anymore. That evening, Mark sat on his porch, Shadow lying beside him in his usual spot, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Mark sipped his beer, listening to the rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant hum of traffic. Ace lay a few feet away, sprawled out after a long day of training, content in his new life. Mark looked between the two dogs, his past and his future. Shadow had been his partner in the hardest years of his career, his protector, his friend. Ace would be his partner in the years to come, his next chapter, his new bond. He had once feared that moving forward would feel like betrayal. Now he realized it was just part of the journey. Shadow let out a slow sigh, resting his head against Mark's knee. Ace glanced over from his spot in the grass, eyes flicking between them before inching closer, laying down beside his predecessor. Mark let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah," he murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "I think you like him after all." And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt something settle inside him. Not loss, not regret, just peace. A few months had passed since Ace officially joined Mark's team, and life had settled into a new normal. The young German Shepherd was growing into his role as a police K9, sharper with each training session, more confident with every shift. Mark had stopped comparing him to Shadow long ago. That wasn't to say he didn't still think about his old partner. Shadow had taken well to retirement, but his once boundless energy had slowed. His walks were shorter, his naps longer, and though he still kept an eye on the house as if it were his assigned post, Mark could see the gray creeping into his muzzle. He had spent years watching over Mark. Now Mark was the one watching over him. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mark sat on the back porch, watching as Ace trotted through the yard with a toy clamped between his teeth. The young dog was still full of energy, bounding through the grass like he had no concept of exhaustion. Shadow lay in the shade of the porch, his eyes half-lidded, his breathing slow and steady, watching as always but no longer chasing. Ace, noticing him, pranced over and dropped the toy beside Shadow's paws, his tail wagging expectantly. Shadow lifted his head, giving the toy a half-hearted sniff, but he didn't move to play. Ace let out a small whine, nudging it closer. Mark watched carefully, his chest tightening. Shadow had once been relentless, tireless. He had never ignored a game of fetch, never turned down a chance to chase, to compete. But now he just laid his head back down, letting out a slow sigh. Ace let out another whine, ears flattening slightly before finally picking the toy back up and trotting away. Mark swallowed hard. Shadow had given everything, his years, his energy, his strength. And now, the final stage of his journey had begun. That night, Mark sat beside him on the porch, the moonlight casting long shadows across the yard. Shadow rested his head against Mark's leg, his breathing deep and even. Mark ran his fingers through his fur, feeling the weight of time catching up. "You've done your job," he murmured. "You don't have to fight anymore. Shadow let out a soft huff, his tail giving the faintest twitch. Mark smiled sadly. I'm gonna be okay. Ace is gonna be okay. You trained me well, partner. Shadow didn't move, but somewhere deep in those golden brown eyes, there was understanding. And so they sat, side by side, as they had done for years, one final time under the stars. The next morning, when the sun rose over the horizon, Shadow didn't wake up. Mark knew it was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Ace stood beside him as he buried Shadow in the backyard, just beneath the old oak tree where he had spent so many lazy afternoons. The best dog, the best partner, the best friend Mark had ever had. He placed a small wooden marker at the base of the tree, simple but meaningful. Shadow, forever my partner. Ace sat beside him, watching as Mark took one last deep breath. Then he exhaled, placed a hand on Ace's back, and stood. Come on, rookie, he murmured. We've got work to do. Ace wagged his tail once before following him back inside. The past would always be with him, but the future was waiting, and Mark was finally ready to move forward.